I'll be presenting on Dylan Thomas's poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Dylan Marlies Thomas was born on October 27, 1914, in Swansea, South Wales. Over the course of his career, he was a poet, a journalist, a scriptwriter, a broadcaster, and even a film writer. He wrote 3 films. His father was an English literature professor at a local grammar school. Thomas grew up with his father reciting Shakespeare to him, and from his youth, Thomas loved the rhythmic ballads of Gerard Manley Hopkins, W.B. Yeats, and Edgar Allan Poe. At the age of 16, Thomas dropped out of school to become a junior reporter for the South Wales Daily Post. In December of 1932, he left his job in order to write poetry full-time. During this time, Thomas wrote the majority of his poems. In 1934, Thomas moved to London, won the Poets' Corner Book Prize, and published his first book, titled 18 Poems, and it had great success and really put him on the map in terms of his writing. In 1947, Thomas was awarded a traveling scholarship from the Society of Authors. He went to Florence, Italy, and while there, wrote In Country Sleep and other poems. And this collection is his most famous poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, which is arguably the most popular and most well-known poem of the 20th century. In 1950, he began doing reading tours in America. His reading tours were very famous because Thomas was the archetypal romantic poet of the popular American imagination. He was theatrical, engaged in wrong disputes in public, and read his work aloud with tremendous depth of feeling. And these readings in America helped put the art of poetry reading, give it prominence. In 1953, while touring in America, he collapsed in the Chelsea Hotel after a drinking stint at a tavern. On November 9, 1953, he died at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City at the young age of 39. So, Thomas's style of poetry. Thomas's poetry does not completely align with any one literary group. Rather, elements from his poetry fit into both the modernist and romantic movements. Thomas's modernist contemporaries would have been writers like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. They were very concerned with poetry establishing themes of social and intellectual issues. During the time period, it's kind of expected that poetry talk about social issues. However, Thomas's writing reflected the more romantic traditions of powerful lyricism and strong emotion. Thomas himself describes how he develops his style of writing as, I make one image, though make is not the right word. I let perhaps an image be made emotionally in me, and then apply it to what intellectual and critical forces I possess. I let it breed another. Let that image contradict the first. Make of the third image, bred out of the other two, together, a fourth contradictory image, and let them all, with my imposed formal limits, conflict. And then some criticism on Thomas's style of writing poetry. In Elder Olson's 1954 criticism of Thomas's poetry, he wrote, a further characteristic which distinguished Thomas's work from that of other poets, it was unclassifiable. Olson continued that no social reference could be found in Thomas's poetry, therefore critics could not explicate it. On Thomas's style of writing, Michael Schmidt explains that there is a kind of authority to the word magic of the early poems. In the famous and popular later poems, the magic is all show. If they have a secret, it is the one that we all share. Partly erotic, partly elegiac, the later poems arise out of personality, and Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night would be classified as one of his later poems. So, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. There's actually a recording of Dylan Thomas himself reading this poem on YouTube, and I've attached the link there. We're actually gonna listen to him read the first 2 stanzas.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
So you can see there from listening to it, when he reads his poetry, he's very theatrical and engaged and emotional. So it's really awesome to hear him read it himself. So the poem was actually written in 1947, but it wasn't published until 1951 when it was published in the journal Bataille Oscure. Some suggest that Thomas was inspired to write the poem by the dying of his own father, David John Thomas. However, his father died in 1952, which would have been several years after the poem was written and published. Therefore, the speaker of the poem would not have been Dylan Thomas himself, but an anonymous speaker. So the structure of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. The poem is a villanelle, a fixed form poem consisting of 5 tarsets in a quatrain, and also follows a specific rhyme scheme using only 2 different sounds. In villanelles, 2 different lines repeat throughout the poem, and those lines would be Do not go gentle into that good night, in rage, rage against the dying of the light. Also in a villanelle, the rhyme scheme is ABA, and I've marked that in the example below. And this means that the final word of the first and third lines in every tarset rhyme together. So if you see here, night, light, right, and night. Also, the middle lines rhyme with each other, so that's day and they. And like the definition said of a villanelle, there's only rhymings of 2 different sounds, and those are the ones we just heard. So for analysis of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, ultimately the poem is about death. From the last stanza, it is clear that the speaker is witnessing the death of his own father. The speaker is conveying his knowledge that death cannot be avoided, but that it can and should be challenged. Therefore, fighting death is viewed as valiant in the poem. The raw emotion that the speaker is experiencing are anger at death for coming for his father, and then desperately urging his father not to face death passively. For some more analysis, literary devices, you'll see in jam it in about half of the stanzas of the poem, and in jam it is when there's no pause at the end of a line or sentence. It just keeps on going to the next. And this creates motion and also drama because it makes it a little more intense in the poem. For themes, the unstoppable nature of death. So death is not a choice for the men in the poem. Regardless of how hard they fight, ultimately death is going to come for them and there's nothing they can do about it. Also, the power of life. Death attacks the vitality and just the overall power of life and just kind of takes it away, basically. And then the limit of time, that just illustrates how short life is. And you can also see how in each of the stanzas, the different men are kind of reflecting on regret they've had at the end of their life. Criticism of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. This is by Ashley Robinson. Robinson argues that the poem's primary purpose is to think about death, but more specifically, Thomas's poem tells people not to go gentle into death, and for why is that, Robinson claims that Thomas does this to serve as a small way to triumph something they have no control over in the end. Put another way, if you can't avoid dying, it's better to go down fighting than to not fight at all. And then ultimately, Robinson argues that Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night focuses on a person's literal final choice, not whether or not to die, but how they will face the inevitable. And then here are my sources.